Similarly, the Tissø complex in Denmark, which was one of the most important ritual and administrative centers in Viking Age Scandinavia, has yielded a remarkable collection of metalwork to finds that includes numerous items decorated with wolf and raven motifs, many of them associated with what appears to have been a long-lived cult site dedicated to Odin and Tyr. The concentration of wolf and raven imagery at Tissø is not coincidental, but reflects the site's function as a center for the kind of elite ritual practice that was most closely associated with these sacred animals. A place where the powerful men who led Norse society came to make offerings to the gods, to seek divine favor for their military and political enterprises, and to perform the rituals that maintained the connection between the human world and the divine world that the Norse believed was essential for the continued stability of the cosmos. The runestones of the Viking Age, which we have already mentioned in passing, deserve more detailed attention as a category of material evidence for the wolf and raven associations, because they represent one of the most public and most monumental forms of expression available to the Norse. Statements carved in stone and erected in prominent locations where they could be seen and read by the entire community. The imagery on runestones is not merely decorative, but is semantically loaded, carrying meanings that were immediately legible to any Norse person who encountered them, and that communicated specific messages about the identity, status, and values of the individuals commemorated, and the communities that erected the stones. The presence of wolf and raven imagery on runestones, therefore, tells us that these animals were deemed appropriate and significant markers of identity for the people commemorated, and the contexts in which they appear, typically associated with warriors and leaders of high status, confirms what the literary evidence suggests about the particular association of wolves and ravens with the warrior elite and with the Odinic cult that was so central to that elite's self-understanding. The Ramsund carving in Södermanland, Sweden, is one of the most famous Viking Age rock carvings and provides a particularly rich example of the integration of wolf and raven imagery into a broader narrative context. The carving, which dates to approximately the early 11th century and was commissioned by a woman named Sigritha to commemorate the construction of a bridge and the memory of her husband, depicts scenes from the legend of Sigurður the Dragon Slayer, including the killing of the dragon Fafnir and the roasting of Fafnir's heart, and incorporates bird imagery that has been interpreted as representing the ravens, whose speech Sigurður gains the ability to understand after accidentally tasting the dragon's blood. This episode from the Sigurður legend, in which the hero's consumption of the dragon's blood gives him the ability to understand the language of birds, connecting him to the wisdom of the natural world, and ultimately warning him of the treachery being plotted against him, resonates powerfully with the broader Norse theme of ravens as carriers of hidden knowledge and divine communication. The Ramsund carving places this episode within a public memorial context, suggesting that the story of Sigurður's raven wisdom was sufficiently widely known and sufficiently valued that it could serve as an appropriate decorative and narrative program for a monument intended to honor a real person and to communicate something meaningful about the values and beliefs of the community in which that person had lived. The ship burials of the Viking Age, which are among the most spectacular and most intensively studied of all Viking archaeological sites, provide yet another category of evidence for the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens, evidence that is particularly significant because ship burials represent the highest level of ritual investment that Norse society devoted to the commemoration of the dead, and the choices made in their construction and furnishing therefore reflect the deepest and most carefully considered beliefs about the afterlife and the nature of sacred power. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in 1904 from a burial mound in Vestfold, Norway, and dating to approximately 834 CE, is the richest and most completely preserved of all Viking ship burials, and its extraordinary collection of grave goods includes numerous objects decorated with animal imagery that has been the subject of intensive scholarly analysis. Among the most remarkable of these objects is a series of carved wooden posts, known as the animal head posts or the Oseberg post finials, which are decorated with elaborately stylized animal heads, whose precise identification has been debated by scholars for decades. Some researchers have identified these carved heads as representations of wolves or wolf-like creatures, while others have seen them as stylized depictions of other animals, and the debate over their identification reflects the broader difficulty of interpreting Viking Age animal art, which often employs a level of stylization that makes definitive species identification impossible. What is clear, regardless of the precise identification of the specific animals depicted on the Oseberg post-finials, is that animal imagery of a charged and significant kind was a dominant feature of the most important Viking burial of the era, and that the people who designed and executed the Oseberg burial understood animal representations as appropriate and meaningful elements of a royal funerary assemblage. The presence of actual animal remains in the Oseberg burial, including the skeletons of 15 horses, 4 dogs, and various other animals, further confirms that the boundary between animal symbolism and actual animal presence was not sharp but permeable in the Norse funerary context, and that the animals interred with the dead were understood to serve a real rather than merely symbolic function in the world after death, accompanying their owners into whatever realm lay beyond the grave and providing them with the qualities and capabilities that these animals embodied in the living world. The dogs buried at Oseberg, whose skeletal morphology suggests animals of considerable size and strength that may have had some relationship with wolf ancestry, were almost certainly prized hunting and companion animals whose presence in the burial reflected both their practical value and their spiritual significance as creatures that occupied the liminal space between the domestic and wild, between the human world and the world of wolves. The Gokstad ship burial, also located in Vestfold, and excavated in 1880, provides complementary evidence for the Norse practice of including animals in high-status burials, yielding the remains of horses, dogs, and a peacock alongside the body of a tall, powerfully built man in his 60s who had suffered from a bone disease, but who had clearly been a figure of considerable importance in his lifetime. The presence of dogs in both the Oseberg and Gokstad burials, and in numerous other Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and the Norse diaspora, confirms the importance of canid companions in Norse elite culture, and raises the question of the extent to which the spiritual significance of wolves was projected onto the domestic dogs that shared the daily lives of Norse people. Dogs, as the domesticated descendants of wolves, occupied a uniquely ambiguous position in Norse culture, simultaneously the most familiar and the most wolf-like of all the animals in the Norse environment. Creatures whose loyalty and affection were the product of the same essential nature that made their wild cousins feared and revered, the nature of the pack animal, of the creature that lives and hunts and defends in groups, that recognizes hierarchy and maintains it through ritual and submission and occasional displays of force. The dog was, in this sense, the tamed face of the wolf brought into the human sphere and made a partner rather than a threat. And the Norse relationship with dogs was therefore not separate from, but continuous with the Norse relationship with wolves, a domesticated version of the same spiritual bond that connected the human and the lupine at the deepest level of Norse culture. The broader European context of wolf and raven symbolism in the early medieval period helps to situate the Norse tradition within a larger pattern of Germanic and Indo-European sacred animal associations that suggests the roots of the Viking relationship with these creatures extend far back beyond the Viking Age itself into a prehistoric past that predates even the differentiation of the Germanic peoples from the larger Indo-European cultural complex. Wolf symbolism is attested across the full breadth of the Germanic world, from the Anglo-Saxon tradition of kennings for warrior that include wolf compounds, to the Frankish royal names that incorporate the element wolf, to the widespread Germanic practice of incorporating wolf imagery into military equipment and heraldry. The raven, similarly, appears as a sacred bird across the Germanic and Celtic worlds, associated with divine wisdom and prophetic sight in traditions that extend from Ireland to Byzantium, and that share structural similarities that strongly suggest a common prehistoric origin. This broader Indo-European context does not diminish the specifically Norse character of the relationship between Vikings and their sacred animals, but it places that relationship in a perspective that reveals its deep historical roots and its participation in a pan-human tendency to see in certain animals, and particularly in the wolf and the corvid, reflections of the divine qualities that human beings have always sought to cultivate in themselves and to access through their relationships with the more than human world. The Anglo-Saxon tradition, which developed in close parallel with the Norse tradition from the same Germanic roots, provides particularly interesting comparative material for understanding the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens, because it both mirrors and diverges from the Norse tradition in ways that reveal the specific characteristics of the Viking spiritual imagination in relief. In Anglo-Saxon poetry, the wolf and the raven appear together with the eagle as the three beasts of battle, the creatures that attend the aftermath of warfare and feed upon the fallen, and their appearance in this formulaic context, which is attested across a wide range of Anglo-Saxon poems from Beowulf to the lesser-known battle poems, demonstrates the shared Germanic heritage of the Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions. But while the Anglo-Saxon treatment of the beasts of battle is primarily formulaic and decorative, a conventional element of the poetic vocabulary for describing warfare rather than a deeply developed spiritual tradition, the Norse treatment of wolves and ravens goes far deeper, embedding these animals in a comprehensive mythological and cosmological framework that the Anglo-Saxon tradition lacks, or at least does not preserve in comparable detail. This difference may reflect the more complete Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England relative to Scandinavia, which may have suppressed or obscured earlier Anglo-Saxon religious traditions that were more similar to the Norse, or it may reflect a genuine difference in the degree of elaboration that the two traditions devoted to the spiritual significance of these animals, a difference that would be consistent with the more thoroughly shamanic character of Norse religion as compared to the more tribal and martial religion of the early Anglo-Saxons. The Norman tradition, which emerged from the fusion of Norse settler culture with Frankish Christian culture in the Duchy of Normandy in the 10th and 11th centuries, provides another important comparative perspective on the long-term fate of Norse wolf and raven symbolism as it encountered and was transformed by Christian culture. The Normans, who were the descendants of the Viking settlers who had established themselves in northern France under the leadership of Rollo in the early 10th century, maintained a recognizably Norse cultural identity for several generations, even as they adopted the French language and the Catholic faith. And the persistence of Norse symbolic traditions in Norman heraldry and military culture provides evidence for the tenacity of wolf and raven associations, even in a context of significant cultural transformation. The leopards of the English royal arms, which descend from the heraldic tradition of the Norman dynasty that conquered England in 1066, are sometimes interpreted as stylized lions, but their ultimate heraldic ancestry may include contributions from the Germanic tradition of wolf heraldry that the Normans inherited from their Norse forebears, a genealogy that would connect the symbols of the English monarchy to the sacred wolves of Odin through a chain of cultural transmission stretching across more than 1,000 years. The legacy of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens in modern Scandinavian culture and in the broader global culture that has been shaped by the extraordinary contemporary fascination with Norse mythology and the Viking Age is a topic that deserves more extended treatment than we can give it here. But it is worth sketching in broad outline because it reveals something important about the continuing power of these ancient spiritual associations in a world that has changed almost beyond recognition since the last Viking longship put to sea. The modern interest in Norse mythology, which has manifested in the extraordinary commercial success of films, television series, novels, video games, and graphic novels based on Viking themes, is not a simple nostalgia for a romantic past, but is, in many of its most significant expressions, a genuine engagement with the spiritual and philosophical questions that the Norse tradition raises so powerfully and so honestly, questions about the relationship between strength and wisdom, between the individual and the community, between human civilization and the natural world, between the acceptance of mortality and the affirmation of life in the face of that mortality. In this modern engagement with Norse mythology, wolves and ravens continue to occupy their ancient central position, functioning as symbols not merely of a specific historical culture, but of enduring human concerns that the Norse tradition addresses with a directness and a depth that few other mythological systems can match. The wolf, in particular, has become one of the most powerful symbols in contemporary culture of the tension between wildness and civilization, between the individual who refuses to be domesticated and the social order that demands conformity. And this modern symbolic use of the wolf, while it has been mediated by centuries of literary and cultural transformation, still carries traces of the Norse understanding of the wolf as a creature that exists at the boundary between order and chaos, between the human and the animal, between the sacred and the terrifying. The raven, too, has maintained its cultural power as a symbol of intelligence, of mystery, of the perception of hidden truths, and of the connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, associations that are recognizably descended from the Norse tradition of Hugin and Munin, even when those who employ the raven as a symbol are entirely unaware of their mythological antecedents. The scientific study of wolves and ravens in the modern era has, in a remarkable and somewhat ironic way, provided empirical confirmation for many of the qualities that the Norse attributed to these animals on spiritual grounds, confirming that the Norse were not projecting human qualities onto indifferent animals, but were accurately perceiving genuine characteristics of creatures with whom they shared their world. The wolf's extraordinary social intelligence, its capacity for cooperation and communication within the pack, its emotional life, and its ability to form deep and lasting bonds with both members of its own species and with humans, have all been documented in extensive field studies that paint a picture of the wolf as a creature of remarkable cognitive and emotional sophistication, a creature that is, in the most meaningful sense, worthy of the respect and the spiritual attention that the Norse devoted to it. Similarly, the raven's intelligence, which has been the subject of intensive scientific research in recent decades, has proven to be even more extraordinary than the most optimistic naturalist could have predicted, revealing a bird that possesses theory of mind, that can plan for the future, that can solve problems requiring multi-step reasoning, and that can cooperate with members of other species including wolves and humans, in ways that suggest a level of social and cognitive flexibility that approaches, in some respects, the cognitive flexibility of the great apes. These scientific revelations about the true nature of wolves and ravens, while they come from a completely different epistemological tradition than the one that produced the Norse mythological framework, nevertheless point in the same direction as the Norse spiritual understanding of these animals, confirming that the Norse were right to see in wolves and ravens something extraordinary, something that exceeded the ordinary animal and that demanded a special quality of attention and engagement. The Norse expressed this recognition in mythological and spiritual terms, in stories of divine ravens and cosmic wolves and shamanic transformations, because that was the language available to them for expressing truths about the depth and complexity of the more than human world. We express the same recognition in scientific terms in studies of animal cognition and social behavior and interspecies cooperation, because that is the language available to us. But the underlying recognition is the same. The recognition that wolves and ravens are not merely animals in the ordinary sense, not merely biological machines performing genetically programmed behaviors, but are beings of genuine intelligence and genuine social complexity, whose presence in the world enriches and complicates and deepens our understanding of what consciousness is and what it can be. The terrifying spiritual truth that the Vikings grasped about wolves and ravens was not simply that these animals were powerful or dangerous, though they were both of those things, and not simply that they were associated with death and with the gods, though they were both of those things as well. The terrifying truth was deeper and more universal than any of these specific associations, a truth about the nature of the relationship between human consciousness and the non-human world, a truth that the Norse expressed through their mythology and their ritual and their poetry and their art, and that we are still, in our own way, working to fully understand and to adequately express. The truth is that the boundary between the human and the animal, between the thinking, speaking, meaning-making creature that we call the self and the vast, complex, deeply intelligent web of life that surrounds us, is not a wall but a membrane, not a fixed barrier, but a permeable interface, across which information and energy, and perhaps something that we might cautiously call experience, flows continuously in both directions, and that the creatures that live closest to that membrane, the wolves and the ravens, who inhabit the boundary zones between civilization and wilderness, between the domestic and the wild, between the human world and the world of the gods, are the creatures through which this truth becomes most clearly visible. To keep wolves and ravens as sacred companions, as the Norse did in their imagination and in their ritual practice and in the stories they told about their greatest god, was to maintain a relationship with this truth, to refuse to let it be forgotten in the comfortable routines of daily life, to insist on remaining aware of the vast, wild, morally indifferent, spiritually charged reality that lay just beyond the firelight, always present, always powerful, always ready to reclaim whatever human civilization had built on the narrow margin of safety that the gods had carved out of the primordial chaos. The wolf at the edge of the firelight and the raven on the branch above the battlefield were not threats to be eliminated or dangers to be managed, but were reminders, sacred reminders, of the truth of the human condition, of the smallness and the brevity and the extraordinary preciousness of the human moment in a universe that is overwhelmingly non-human, a universe that preceded us by unimaginable eons, and that will outlast us by eons more, a universe in which the wolves will always be running, and the ravens will always be flying, and the great cycle of creation and destruction will continue long after the last fire of human civilization has gone dark. This is what the Vikings knew, and this is what their sacred animals taught them, and this is why, more than 1,000 years after the last Norse longship was launched, and the last skald sang his poems in the hall of a Viking king, the wolf and the raven still speak to something deep and wordless in the human soul, still carry in their yellow eyes and their black wings the weight of a spiritual tradition that understood with a clarity and a courage that we have not yet surpassed and may never surpass, the terrifying and magnificent truth of what it means to be alive in this world, to be conscious and mortal and hungry and aware, to stand at the edge of the known and to look out into the darkness beyond and to see, looking back, the eyes of the wolf and the wings of the raven, and to know in the deepest and most wordless part of oneself that these are not enemies but kin, not threats but mirrors, not the darkness that we fear, but the darkness from which we came, and to which, in the fullness of time, we will all inevitably return. The question of how the Norse spiritual relationship with wolves and ravens was transmitted across time and transformed by the encounter with Christianity is one that requires us to move beyond the Viking Age itself and into the longer historical arc of Scandinavian cultural development, tracing the ways in which the sacred associations of these animals persisted, mutated, went underground, and occasionally resurfaced in new forms across the centuries that separated the world of Odin and Fenrir from the world of the modern Scandinavian nations that are their cultural descendants. This transmission was not a simple or a linear process, but was instead a complex, multi-directional negotiation between old and new, between the deep structures of a spiritual tradition that had developed over many centuries of intimate human engagement with the northern landscape and its creatures, and the new theological framework that Christianity brought with it, a framework that was, in many respects, fundamentally incompatible with the Norse understanding of the sacred, but that was, in practice, applied to Scandinavian society by people who were themselves products of the culture they were seeking to transform. People who could not simply erase the old ways of seeing and feeling and understanding the world, but who had to find ways of accommodating, redirecting, and gradually replacing them. The result of this long and complex process of cultural negotiation was not the simple triumph of Christianity over paganism, but a layered, hybrid cultural reality in which elements of the old Norse spiritual tradition survived within the new Christian framework in various transformed and disguised forms, waiting, in some cases, for the conditions that would allow them to resurface and reassert their ancient power.